I'm Sarah Chen, and my story begins with the most ridiculous family fight you could imagine. 6 months after my father's funeral, my siblings were literally screaming at each other over a $50 wallet he'd given me for my birthday, demanding I split the inheritance 3 ways because it wasn't fair that I got something, and they didn't. What they didn't know, what none of us knew, was that in exactly 17 minutes, Patricia Rodriguez would walk into our mother's living room and announce that my grandfather had left me a trust fund worth $1.2 billion. The same grandfather we thought died broke. The same grandfather whose funeral we'd argued about paying for just 2 years earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That Sunday afternoon started like every other family gathering since Dad's death, with tension thick enough to cut with a knife and my siblings treating me like the family afterthought. I was sitting in the corner of Mom's beige living room in Tempe, clutching the brown leather wallet Dad had given me for my 28th birthday, just weeks before his heart attack took him from us. The wallet wasn't expensive, probably picked up from some discount store during his lunch break, but it was the last gift he'd ever give me, and for that reason alone, it was priceless. Marcus, my older brother at 32, stood near the fireplace with his arms crossed, his face red, with the kind of righteous indignation he usually reserved for difficult real estate clients. His perfectly pressed polo shirt and khakis screamed success, though I knew his Desert Vista Realty business was struggling more than he'd ever admit to the family. Jessica sat on the edge of Mom's floral couch, her manicured nails tapping against her designer purse, her blonde highlights catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. At 30, she'd perfected the art of looking perpetually disappointed, and today that disappointment was laser-focused on me. "It's not about the money," Jessica was saying for the 3rd time, though her tone suggested it was entirely about the money. "It's about fairness. Dad gave Sarah something valuable, and the rest of us got nothing. We should split whatever it's worth." David, my baby brother at 25, nodded enthusiastically from his position sprawled across Mom's recliner, his Arizona State University sweatshirt wrinkled from what was probably another late-night gaming session. "Exactly. $50 is $50. That's like 2 weeks of groceries for a college student." I wanted to point out that his college student status had been going on for 7 years now, funded entirely by Mom's retirement savings. But I'd learned long ago that challenging David only made family gatherings more unbearable. Instead, I held the wallet closer to my chest and tried to find my voice. "He gave this to me specifically," I said quietly, my words barely carrying across the room. "For my birthday. It wasn't meant to be divided up." Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that made me flinch. "Sarah, come on! You're 28 years old. You have a job. David's struggling to make ends meet. And Jessica just bought a house. You could be more generous with family." The familiar weight of being the practical one settled onto my shoulders like a lead blanket. This was the story of my life in the Chen family. Sarah doesn't need much. Sarah is independent. Sarah can take care of herself. It had started in childhood when I'd received sensible gifts like school supplies and savings bonds, while my siblings got the latest toys and gadgets. It continued through college when I'd worked 3 part-time jobs to pay for community college and state school, while Marcus and Jessica had attended expensive private universities without question. Even now, working as a graphic designer at a small creative agency in downtown Phoenix, I was expected to be grateful for my modest life while supporting my siblings' grander ambitions. Mom sat in her usual spot at the kitchen table, visible through the open archway that connected the living room to her small galley kitchen. At 55, Linda Chen looked older than her years, the stress of losing Dad and managing the family's constant financial drama having carved deep lines around her eyes. She'd been a nurse for 30 years before retiring early to care for Dad during his final illness, and now she spent her days trying to referee fights between her adult children. "Maybe we could find a compromise," Mom suggested weakly, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd had this same conversation in various forms for decades. "Sarah, honey, you know your siblings are going through difficult times." The assumption that I wasn't going through difficult times stung, though I'd heard variations of it my entire life. My rent-controlled studio apartment in downtown Phoenix barely qualified as livable, with its broken air conditioning and a kitchen so small I had to choose between owning a microwave or a toaster. My 10-year-old Honda Civic had over 200,000 miles on it and made concerning noises that I couldn't afford to investigate. My job at Creative Solutions Design Agency paid just enough to cover my basic expenses, with nothing left over for the emergencies that seemed to strike with clockwork regularity. But because I'd never asked the family for money, because I'd never complained about my circumstances, because I'd perfected the art of making do with less, everyone assumed I was thriving. Sarah's got it together. Sarah doesn't need help. Sarah should help everyone else. I'm not going through difficult times? I asked, my voice rising slightly with uncharacteristic defiance. I haven't had a vacation in 4 years. I eat ramen noodles for dinner more often than I care to admit. My car is held together with duct tape and prayer. But because I don't ask for help, you all assume I'm fine? Jessica rolled her eyes, a gesture so familiar it triggered muscle memory from our childhood. Please, Sarah, you chose to live that minimalist lifestyle. You could have a better job if you wanted one. You could have gone to a better school if you'd applied yourself more. The casual dismissal of my struggles and achievements hit like a physical blow. I had applied myself. I had graduated summa cum laude from Arizona State with a degree in graphic design while working multiple jobs. I'd built a portfolio that had earned recognition from industry professionals. I'd chosen to work at a smaller agency because I believed in their mission of supporting local nonprofits and small businesses, even though it meant lower pay than the corporate design firms that had offered me positions. You don't know anything about my choices, I said, standing up from the couch with the wallet still clutched in my hands. You don't know about the opportunities I've turned down or the sacrifices I've made. You just assume that because I don't complain, everything is easy for me. Marcus stepped forward, his expression shifting from annoyance to something that looked almost like concern, though I'd learned not to trust his occasional moments of apparent empathy. Look, we're not trying to attack you. We're just saying that family means sharing, especially when someone is struggling. David really needs the money. David needs to get a job, I shot back, the words escaping before I could stop them. He's been in college for 7 years, Mom has been supporting him completely, and he still finds money for the latest video games and designer sneakers. Maybe the problem isn't that I got a $50 wallet. Maybe the problem is that we've all enabled him to be completely irresponsible with money. The silence that followed was deafening. David's face flushed red, Jessica's mouth dropped open in shock, and Marcus looked like I'd just committed some unforgivable breach of family loyalty. Even Mom seemed startled by my uncharacteristic directness. That's really unfair, Sarah, David said, his voice carrying the petulant tone he'd perfected as a child and never outgrown. I'm pursuing my education. Just because it's taking longer than you think it should, doesn't mean I'm irresponsible. You've changed your major 6 times, I replied, feeling a strange liberation in finally speaking truths that had been building up for years. You're currently studying film production, which is your 3rd completely different career path. You've never held a part-time job for more than 2 months. And somehow you still think you're entitled to share in the one gift Dad specifically gave to me. Jessica stood up from the couch, her marketing manager persona kicking into full gear. This is exactly why we need to talk about this rationally. Sarah, you're clearly feeling attacked, but we're family. Family supports each other. Dad would have wanted us to share whatever he left behind. He didn't leave this behind, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. He gave this to me, personally, for my birthday. It's not part of some estate to be divided. It was a gift from a father to his daughter, and you want to tear it apart for the cash value. The doorbell rang, cutting through the tension like a knife through butter. We all froze, looking toward the front door as if it might provide some escape from the increasingly heated argument. Mom glanced at her watch with a confused expression. I'm not expecting anyone, she said, rising slowly from her kitchen chair. Sarah, were you expecting someone? I shook my head, still holding the wallet against my chest like a shield. The idea that anyone would visit me at Mom's house was almost laughable. My social life was limited to work colleagues and a few college friends who had long since moved away from Phoenix. I certainly wasn't the type of person who received unexpected visitors during family gatherings. Mom walked to the front door, her house slippers shuffling against the tile floor. Through the window, we could see a figure in a dark business suit, someone who clearly didn't belong in our middle-class Tempe neighborhood, where people wore casual clothes and drove practical cars. "Mrs. Chen?" came a professional female voice as Mom opened the door. "I'm Patricia Rodriguez from Rodriguez & Associates. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I've been trying to reach your family for several weeks regarding the estate of William Chen." The name hit the room like a physical force. William Chen. My grandfather. Dad's father, who had died 2 years earlier after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. The grandfather whose funeral we'd argued about paying for because nobody had money for anything more elaborate than cremation and a small memorial service. The grandfather who had lived in a modest apartment and seemed to survive on Social Security and whatever small savings he'd managed to accumulate during his working years. Mom's face went pale as she stepped back to allow the lawyer into the house. Patricia Rodriguez was a woman in her 40s, with perfectly styled black hair and a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. She carried expensive leather briefcase and had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to delivering important news. "I'm sorry," Mom said, her voice shaky. "I don't understand. Dad's estate was settled 2 years ago. There wasn't much to settle. He had a small savings account and some personal belongings. Everything was divided according to his will." Patricia Rodriguez smiled gently, setting her briefcase on Mom's coffee table with deliberate care. "Mrs. Chen, I think there may have been some misunderstanding about your father-in-law's financial situation. May I sit down? This conversation may take some time." Marcus, Jessica, and David had gone completely silent, their argument about my $50 wallet suddenly seeming trivial in the face of this unexpected development. I found myself moving closer to the group, still clutching the wallet but now focused entirely on this mysterious lawyer who had appeared in our living room like something from a movie. "Of course," Mom said, gesturing toward the couch. "Can I get you some coffee? Water?" "Water would be lovely, thank you," Patricia replied, settling onto the couch with practiced grace. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of documents, arranging them on the coffee table with the precision of someone who had performed this ritual many times before. As Mom bustled around in the kitchen, the rest of us arranged ourselves in a rough semicircle around the coffee table, our earlier argument forgotten in the face of this mysterious development. I took a seat in the chair closest to the kitchen, partly to be near Mom when she returned and partly because sitting near my siblings felt uncomfortable after our heated exchange. Patricia accepted the glass of water from Mom with a grateful nod, then looked around the room at all of us before speaking. "Before we begin, I need to confirm the identities of everyone present. Mrs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Chen, you're Linda Chen, widow of Robert Chen?" "Yes," Mom replied, settling back into her kitchen chair. "And these are Robert's children?" Patricia's gaze moved systematically around the room. "Marcus, Jessica, David, and Sarah?" We each nodded or murmured confirmation, the formal nature of the proceeding making everyone uncomfortable. This wasn't how family conversations usually went in the Chen household. We were more accustomed to chaos and interruption than legal procedures and careful documentation. "Excellent," Patricia said, making notes on a legal pad. "Now I need to explain why I'm here. 2 years ago, when William Chen passed away, his immediate estate was indeed small and was distributed according to his publicly filed will. However, what the family was not aware of was that William had established several private trusts and investment accounts over the course of his lifetime, accounts that were not part of his probate estate. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of Mom's refrigerator in the kitchen. Marcus leaned forward, his real estate agent instincts clearly engaged by talk of hidden assets. "What kind of trusts?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Patricia smiled again, the expression of someone who enjoyed delivering surprising news. William Chen was far more financially sophisticated than his family realized. Beginning in the 1980s, he made a series of investments in technology companies, many of which were considered highly speculative at the time. He also invested early in cryptocurrency, purchased patents, and established what we would now recognize as a diversified venture capital portfolio. Jessica's mouth fell open. Grandpa was into cryptocurrency? He could barely use a cell phone. Your grandfather was a remarkably intelligent man who understood the value of emerging technologies long before they became mainstream, Patricia replied. He was also extremely private about his financial affairs, apparently believing that knowledge of his wealth would negatively impact his family's work ethic and personal development. David sat up straighter in his chair, and I could practically see dollar signs reflected in his eyes. So how much are we talking about here? Thousands? Tens of thousands? Patricia consulted her documents, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the rustle of papers. When she looked up, her expression was serious, but not without warmth. The total value of William Chen's private trusts and investment accounts, as of last week's market close, is approximately $1.2 billion. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet. It was as if the very air in the room had been sucked away, leaving us all in some kind of vacuum where normal sound couldn't exist. Marcus's face went completely blank. Jessica made a small choking sound, and David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Mom was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I'm sorry, did you say billion? With a B. Yes, Mrs. Chen. $1.2 billion. With a B. The wallet in my hands suddenly felt absurdly insignificant. My siblings had been fighting over $50 while sitting in the same room where we'd just learned that our family was connected to more money than any of us could have imagined in our wildest dreams. The irony was so overwhelming I almost started laughing, though I managed to maintain my composure. Marcus found his voice next, though it sounded strained and unfamiliar. And this is all going to be divided between the four of us? Split evenly? Patricia shook her head, consulting her documents again. Actually, no. This is where the situation becomes more complex, and why I specifically needed to meet with all of you together. She withdrew a separate document from her folder, one that looked older and more formal than the others. William Chen was very specific about the distribution of his assets. The trusts he established have different beneficiaries and different terms. I felt a strange sinking sensation in my stomach, as if I'd been on an elevator that had suddenly started descending too quickly. In my family's history, whenever something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. What does that mean exactly? I asked, my voice sounding small in the suddenly charged atmosphere of the room. Patricia's eyes met mine directly, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her professional composure seemed to soften slightly. Sarah, according to the documentation I have here, you are the sole beneficiary of the largest trust, which contains approximately $1 billion. The remaining $200 million is divided among several smaller trusts for various family members and charitable organizations. The world tilted sideways. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just consumed everything I thought I knew about my life. $1 billion. The number was so large it didn't feel real, didn't connect to anything in my experience or understanding. I lived in a world where $50 was worth fighting over, where a broken air conditioner meant choosing between comfort and groceries, where the idea of financial security meant having enough money in my checking account to last until the next paycheck. I looked around the room at my family's faces, watching as the information processed through their expressions like slow-motion footage of a building collapse. Marcus had gone completely white, his real estate agent composure cracking to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. Jessica's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the way her face had twisted into an expression of disbelief and what looked suspiciously like rage. David appeared to be in shock, his mouth still hanging open as he stared at Patricia Rodriguez like she might suddenly announce this was all an elaborate prank. Mom was crying, quiet tears streaming down her cheeks as she pressed her hands to her mouth. In her eyes, I could see a mixture of grief and relief and something that looked like vindication. Her father-in-law, the man she'd helped care for during his final years, the man whose modest lifestyle had sometimes made her feel guilty about her own small luxuries, had been secretly wealthy beyond imagination. I don't understand, I finally managed to say, my voice coming out hoarse and unfamiliar. Why me? Why not everyone equally? Grandpa barely knew me. I probably talked to him a dozen times in my entire life. Patricia nodded, as if she'd expected this question. Your grandfather left very detailed instructions about his reasoning, which I'm authorized to share with you. He was quite specific about why he structured the trusts the way he did. She withdrew another document from her briefcase. This one handwritten in the careful script I remembered from the few birthday cards Grandpa had sent over the years. My throat tightened as I recognized his handwriting, bringing back memories of a quiet man who had always seemed to observe more than he spoke. This letter was written to be read to the family upon the distribution of the trusts, Patricia said, clearing her throat before beginning to read. To my family, if you are hearing this, it means I am gone, and the time has come to reveal what I have kept hidden for many years. The wealth I accumulated was never meant to be a secret out of shame or greed, but out of a deep concern for how sudden wealth might impact the character and development of those I love most. She paused to take a sip of water, and in that silence, I could hear David shifting restlessly in his chair, and Marcus breathing heavily through his nose. The tension in the room was becoming unbearable. I watched each of my grandchildren carefully over the years, Patricia continued reading, observing not just their achievements but their character, their treatment of others, and their response to both success and difficulty. Marcus, you have always been ambitious and driven, qualities that will serve you well in life, but I observed a tendency to measure success only in financial terms, and to treat those with less as somehow lesser. The trust I have established for you contains $50 million, which I believe will support your goals without encouraging the arrogance that I sometimes saw developing. Marcus made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. $50 million was an unimaginable fortune, but in the context of what I was apparently inheriting, it seemed almost insulting. I could see the muscles in his jaw working as he processed not just the money but the judgment that came with it. Jessica, Patricia read on, you have intelligence and creativity that could change the world, but I worried about your tendency to believe that your needs should always come first, and your willingness to manipulate situations to your advantage. Your trust contains $50 million as well, with the hope that financial security will allow you to develop the empathy and consideration for others that will make you truly successful. Jessica's face had progressed beyond shock into something approaching fury. Her hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, and I could see her struggling to maintain even a semblance of composure. David, Patricia continued, her voice gentle as she delivered what I suspected would be the harshest judgment. You are young and still finding your way, but I was concerned by your assumption that others should always provide for your needs without corresponding effort on your part. I have established a trust that will provide for your education and basic needs until you turn 30. At which point you will receive $25 million if you have demonstrated consistent employment and personal responsibility. If not, the funds will be donated to educational charities that serve students who lack your advantages. The strangled sound David made was barely human. His face had gone red, then white, then red again, and I realized he was probably doing rapid mental calculations about how his current lifestyle measured up to his grandfather's requirements. Sarah, Patricia read, and suddenly every person in the room was staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. You have consistently demonstrated the qualities I most hope to see in my grandchildren. You work hard without complaint, you treat others with kindness, regardless of their circumstances, and you have never expected others to solve your problems or provide for your needs. More importantly, when you struggled, you found ways to help yourself, rather than looking for someone to blame or someone to rescue you. I felt heat rising in my cheeks as Patricia continued reading words that felt too generous, too kind for the person I knew myself to be. I wasn't some paragon of virtue. I was just someone who'd learned early that complaining didn't change anything, and that expecting help usually led to disappointment. I watched you work multiple jobs to pay for your education while never asking family for assistance. I saw you choose a career path that aligned with your values rather than one that would maximize your income. I observed how you treated service workers, elderly neighbors, and even family members who didn't always treat you well in return. You have shown me that sudden wealth will not corrupt your character because your character was never for sale. The room was absolutely silent except for the sound of Mom's quiet crying and the rustle of papers as Patricia turned the page. The majority of my estate goes to Sarah, not because I love the others less, but because I trust her most to use wealth responsibly and to remain the person she has always been, regardless of her bank account balance. Sarah, I hope this gift will allow you to pursue your dreams without compromise and to help others pursue theirs as well. I know you will make decisions that honor both the source of this wealth and the person you have chosen to become. Patricia set down the letter and looked around the room, her professional demeanor intact, despite the emotional weight of the words she'd just delivered. The letter goes on to explain some of the specific terms and conditions of each trust, but those are the core provisions. The silence stretched on until it became unbearable. I could feel my siblings' stares like physical weight, and I realized that in the space of 10 minutes, I had gone from being the overlooked middle child to being the target of more resentment and envy than I'd ever experienced in my life. Marcus was the first to break the silence, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. This is insane. Grandpa met Sarah maybe a dozen times. How could he possibly make character judgments based on such limited contact? Your grandfather was more observant than you might have realized, Patricia replied calmly. He made extensive notes about family interactions during holidays, family gatherings, and even casual conversations. He also spoke regularly with your father about each of you, and your father shared details about your lives, your choices, and your challenges. The mention of Dad sent a fresh wave of grief through me, but it also sparked a memory that I hadn't thought about in years. Dad had always asked me detailed questions about my work, my finances, my goals, questions that had seemed like casual conversation at the time. He'd never offered advice or criticism, just listened with the kind of attention that had made me feel valued and heard. I'd thought it was simply his way of showing interest in my life, but now I wondered if those conversations had been shared with Grandpa, if my father had been unknowingly providing character references that would ultimately change everything. So what happens now? Jessica asked, her voice sharp with an edge I'd never heard before. Sarah gets to be a billionaire while the rest of us split the leftovers? The funds are available immediately for Sarah, Patricia explained, though I would strongly recommend establishing a comprehensive financial management team before making any major decisions. For Marcus and Jessica, your trusts are also available immediately. David, as I mentioned, your situation is somewhat different. David leaned forward in his chair, his expression desperate. What exactly do I need to do to prove responsibility? How is that measured? Patricia consulted another document. The trust specifies consistent employment of at least 30 hours per week for a minimum of 2 consecutive years, completion of your current degree program, and demonstration of financial responsibility through managing a smaller trust fund that will be established for your living expenses. The trust will be administered by an independent financial advisor who will report on your progress. That's completely unfair, David protested, his voice rising to the petulant whine I remembered from childhood tantrums. Everyone else gets their money immediately, but I have to prove myself like some kind of probationary employee? Actually, Marcus said slowly, and I could hear the wheels turning in his head. The unfair part is that Sarah gets 20 times what the rest of us get based on Grandpa's subjective opinion of our characters. The word subjective hit me like a slap. In that moment, I realized that my siblings weren't just disappointed about the money. They genuinely believed that I didn't deserve what I was inheriting. They saw Grandpa's assessment of my character as either completely wrong or irrelevant to the question of who should inherit his wealth. Perhaps, Patricia said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, we should focus on the practical next steps rather than debating your grandfather's decisions. Those decisions are final and legally binding. But they could be challenged, Marcus said, his real estate training evident in his understanding of legal processes, especially if there are questions about Grandpa's mental capacity when he made these decisions. He had Alzheimer's after all. The suggestion that Grandpa might not have been mentally competent when he structured the trusts sent a chill through me. I looked at Patricia, trying to read her expression for any sign that this was a legitimate concern. The trusts were established over a period of many years, Patricia replied firmly, with the most recent modifications made more than 5 years before your grandfather's Alzheimer's diagnosis. All documents were witnessed, notarized, and reviewed by multiple attorneys. Any challenge would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately unsuccessful. But I could see that Marcus wasn't going to let this go easily. His face had taken on the focused intensity he got when he was closing a difficult real estate deal, and I realized that I was probably about to become the target of a legal battle that would tear our family apart permanently. "I need some air," I said suddenly, standing up from my chair with the $50 wallet still clutched in my hands. The irony of holding on to that modest gift while discussing a billion-dollar inheritance was almost too much to bear. I walked out of Mom's living room, through the kitchen, and out the back door into her small backyard. The Arizona heat hit me like a physical force, but it felt cleaner than the suffocating atmosphere inside the house. I sat down on the concrete steps leading to the back patio and tried to process what had just happened to my life. $1 billion. The number kept bouncing around in my head like a pinball, never settling long enough for me to truly comprehend its meaning. It was more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, more money than most people could even conceptualize. It was the kind of wealth that appeared in news articles about tech entrepreneurs and oil heiresses, not in the lives of graphic designers who ate ramen noodles for dinner. But it wasn't just the money that was overwhelming, it was the responsibility that came with it. Grandpa had chosen me not because I was his favorite, but because he believed I could handle this kind of wealth without losing myself in the process. He'd trusted me with not just his life's work, but with the power to impact other people's lives in ways I couldn't even imagine yet. The back door opened behind me, and I turned to see Mom stepping out into the heat. Her face was still streaked with tears, but she looked calmer than she had inside the house. "How are you feeling, honey?" she asked, settling down beside me on the concrete steps. "Terrified," I answered honestly. "This doesn't feel real. This morning I was worried about making rent next month. And now I'm supposed to be responsible for more money than I can even count." Mom nodded, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Your grandfather was a wise man, Sarah. If he chose you for this, it's because he saw something in you that maybe you don't see in yourself yet." "But what about Marcus and Jessica and David?" I asked. "They're going to hate me for this. Our family is going to be destroyed." "Your family was already struggling, sweetheart," Mom said gently. "The money didn't create the problems. It just revealed them. Marcus has always been resentful when things don't go his way. Jessica has always believed she deserves more than everyone else. And David has never had to face real consequences for his choices." I looked at her in surprise. Mom had never spoken so directly about my siblings' flaws before. She'd always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made excuses for everyone's behavior. "You sound like you agree with Grandpa's decision," I said. Mom was quiet for a long moment, staring out at her small garden where tomatoes and peppers grew in neat rows despite the harsh desert climate. "Your father and I talked about it sometime," she finally said, "about how differently you kids turned out despite having the same upbringing. We worried that we'd failed somehow with the others, that we'd been too lenient or hadn't taught them the right values." She turned to look at me directly, and I could see a lifetime of parental concern in her eyes. "But with you, we never worried. Even as a little girl, you were kind and responsible and fair. You shared your toys without being asked. You helped with chores without complaining. You stood up for kids who were being bullied, even when it meant you might be bullied too." "I wasn't perfect," I protested, remembering plenty of childhood moments when I'd been selfish or mean or dishonest. "Nobody's perfect," Mom agreed. "But character isn't about being perfect. It's about consistently trying to do the right thing even when it's difficult or when nobody's watching. That's what your grandfather saw in you, and that's what your father saw too." The mention of Dad brought fresh tears to my eyes. I wished desperately that he could be here to help me navigate this impossible situation, to help me understand what I was supposed to do with this overwhelming gift. "What am I supposed to do now?" I asked. "How do I go back in there and face them? How do I go back to work tomorrow and pretend nothing has changed? How do I live with this kind of wealth without becoming someone I don't recognize?" Mom smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since Patricia Rodriguez had arrived. "You take it one day at a time, just like you've always done. You remember who you are and why your grandfather trusted you. And you remember that money is just a tool. What matters is what you build with it." Inside the house, I could hear raised voices as my siblings continued to argue about the trusts, probably exploring every possible angle for challenging Grandpa's decisions. The sound made my stomach clench with anxiety, but it also strengthened my resolve. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life defending my grandfather's choices, or apologizing for receiving a gift I'd never asked for. I should probably go back in there, I said, though the prospect filled me with dread. You should, Mom agreed. But remember, you don't owe them explanations or apologies. Your grandfather made his decision based on years of observation and careful thought. You don't have to justify it to anyone. I stood up from the concrete steps, brushing dust off my jeans and preparing to face whatever chaos awaited me inside. The $50 wallet was still in my hands, and I realized that in some ways, it had become even more meaningful than before. It represented the last connection to my old life, the life where $50 was significant, and a leather wallet from a discount store was a treasured gift. When I walked back into the living room, the atmosphere was even more tense than when I'd left. Marcus was pacing near the fireplace, his face red with agitation. Jessica sat rigidly on the couch with her arms crossed, her expression cold and calculating. David had moved to the kitchen table next to Mom's empty chair, and he looked like he was on the verge of tears. Patricia Rodriguez remained seated at the coffee table, her professional composure intact despite the family drama unfolding around her. When she saw me return, she consulted her watch and began gathering her documents. I should probably wrap up the initial consultation, she said diplomatically. Sarah, I'll need to schedule follow-up meetings to discuss the practical aspects of managing your inheritance. There are investment decisions to be made, tax implications to consider, and various legal documents that will need your signature. What about the rest of us? Marcus demanded. When do we get access to our trusts? Your funds can be transferred within the week, Patricia replied. I'll have my office contact each of you to schedule individual appointments to discuss your specific trusts and their terms. Jessica leaned forward, her marketing instincts clearly engaged. And the challenge process? If we wanted to contest the distribution, what would that involve? Patricia's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. As I mentioned earlier, any challenge would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately unsuccessful. Your grandfather was thorough in his documentation and planning. However, if you choose to pursue legal action, that is certainly your right. The threat hung in the air between us, and I realized that my relationship with my siblings was probably about to change forever. They weren't just disappointed about the money, they were actively considering legal action against me to get what they believed they deserved. I think, I said quietly, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, that we all need time to process this information before making any decisions about anything. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. Easy for you to say. You just inherited $1 billion. The rest of us are stuck wondering if we'll ever see a fair share of Grandpa's money. $50 million isn't fair? I asked, my own anger finally beginning to surface. You're upset because you're only getting $50 million instead of $300 million? It's not about the amount, Jessica said, though her tone suggested it was entirely about the amount. It's about the principle. It's about family treating family fairly. Like when you all demanded I split Dad's $50 gift 3 ways? I shot back. Was that about treating family fairly? The reference to our earlier argument brought a flush to Jessica's cheeks. That's completely different. How is it different? I pressed. Dad gave me that wallet specifically. Grandpa left me this money specifically. But somehow one gift is supposed to be shared while the other isn't? David stood up from the kitchen table, his face red with frustration. Because $50 and $1 billion aren't the same thing, Sarah. Nobody's life changes over $50, but $1 billion changes everything. You're right, I said, surprising him. $1 billion does change everything. And maybe that's exactly why Grandpa didn't think you were ready for it. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the impact of my words in their faces. The recognition that I'd just articulated what we were all thinking, but nobody had been willing to say out loud. Patricia Rodriguez stood up from the coffee table, clearly recognizing that the family discussion had moved beyond anything she needed to be present for. I'll leave my contact information with all of you, she said, placing business cards on the coffee table. Sarah, I'd like to schedule our first meeting for this week if possible. There are time-sensitive decisions that will need to be made. She gathered her briefcase and moved toward the front door, pausing only to shake hands with each of us in turn. When she reached me, she held my hand a moment longer than necessary. Your grandfather chose well, she said quietly, her words meant only for me. Trust your instincts, and don't let anyone pressure you into decisions you're not comfortable with. After she left, the five of us stood in Mom's living room staring at each other like strangers. The family dynamics that had governed our relationships for nearly 3 decades had just been permanently altered, and none of us knew how to navigate this new reality. Marcus was the first to break the silence. We need to talk about this as a family, he said, his real estate agent voice trying to project calm authority. We need to figure out how to handle this situation without destroying our relationships. What relationships? I asked, feeling a bitter laugh bubble up in my throat. You've spent the last 2 hours trying to figure out how to take money away from me that I never asked for and didn't even know existed until today. We're not trying to take anything away from you, Jessica protested. We're trying to find a fair solution to an unfair situation. Unfair according to who? I demanded. According to you? According to your opinion of what I deserve versus what you deserve. Grandpa made his decision based on 30 years of watching all of us, and his conclusion was that I could be trusted with this responsibility while you couldn't. David's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the little boy who used to cry when he didn't get his way. So you think we don't deserve anything? You think Grandpa was right to basically write us off? I think Grandpa gave each of you exactly what he thought you could handle, I replied, my voice softer now as I saw the genuine hurt in David's expression. Marcus, $50 million is enough to buy any house you want, to expand your business, to never worry about money again. Jessica, the same for you. And David, $25 million when you turn 30 is more than most people see in a lifetime. But it's not equal, Marcus said stubbornly. When has our family ever been about equal? I shot back. When did any of you worry about equal, when I was working 3 jobs to pay for community college, while you went to expensive private schools? When did equal matter when I was eating ramen for dinner while you were vacationing in Europe? When did equal matter when I was driving a 10-year-old car while you were getting new Mercedes for graduation presents? The litany of inequalities I'd never voiced before poured out of me like water from a broken dam. Years of swallowed resentment and accepted unfairness came flooding to the surface. And I realized that this wasn't really about Grandpa's money at all. This was about a lifetime of being treated as the family afterthought, while being expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and support came my way. Mom sank down into her kitchen chair, looking overwhelmed by the emotions that were finally being expressed after years of careful family diplomacy. I never realized, she said quietly. I never saw how unequal things were. Because you didn't want to see it, I said, not unkindly but honestly. It was easier to believe that I was just naturally independent and didn't need as much support as everyone else. It was easier to think that I preferred working multiple jobs and living in tiny apartments because I was minimalist or practical, or whatever story made it okay to invest less in my future than in theirs. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but I held up my hand to stop him. I'm not saying any of this to hurt anyone or to relitigate the past, I continued. I'm saying it because you want to talk about fairness. And fairness isn't just about this money. Fairness is about recognizing that Grandpa saw something in our family dynamics that maybe we've all been pretending didn't exist. I looked around the room at these people who had shaped my entire life, who I loved despite everything, who I was probably about to lose because of circumstances none of us had chosen. I didn't ask for this money, I said finally. I didn't scheme for it or manipulate anyone to get it. It's not a reward I earned or a prize I won. It's a responsibility that Grandpa decided I was best equipped to handle, and honestly, I'm terrified that he was wrong. The admission seemed to deflate some of the tension in the room. Jessica's rigid posture softened slightly, and David stopped looking like he was about to cry. So what happens now? Mom asked, echoing the question that was haunting all of us. Now, I said, I guess we all figure out who we want to be in this new reality. You can spend your energy fighting me and each other, Or you can use your own inheritances to build the lives you've always wanted. But I'm not going to apologize for Grandpa's decision, and I'm not going to give up money he specifically intended for me, just to make everyone else feel better about their own choices. I tucked the $50 wallet into my back pocket, where it belonged, and walked toward the front door. I need time to think about all of this. When you're ready to have conversations that aren't about taking my inheritance away from me, let me know. As I drove home in my ancient Honda Civic, the late afternoon sun blazing through the windshield and the air conditioning making its usual concerning noises, I tried to wrap my mind around the fact that I could probably buy a car dealership now, instead of worrying about whether my current car would make it through another Arizona summer. But more than the money, what stuck with me was the realization that my grandfather had seen me more clearly than my own family had. He'd recognized qualities in me that they'd overlooked or dismissed, and he'd trusted me with wealth that could either corrupt me completely or allow me to become the person I'd always had the potential to be. The question now was which version of myself I would choose to become. My apartment had never felt smaller than it did when I walked through the door that evening, still carrying the $50 wallet and the weight of information that felt too enormous to fit inside my modest studio space. The broken air conditioning unit hummed uselessly in the corner, and the late afternoon heat had turned my living space into what felt like an oven. I set the wallet carefully on my small kitchen counter next to a stack of unpaid bills, and stood in the middle of the room, trying to reconcile the poverty that surrounded me with the wealth I'd just inherited. The contrast was so stark it felt like living in two different realities simultaneously. Here was my futon that doubled as both couch and bed, covered with a throw blanket I'd bought at a thrift store to hide the worn spots in the fabric. There was my kitchen table that seated exactly one person, where I ate most of my meals standing up because the single chair was usually covered with work papers or clean laundry I hadn't had time to put away. And in the corner sat my ancient laptop, held together with electrical tape and prayer, where I created graphic designs for clients who paid just enough to keep me housed and fed, but never enough to build any kind of financial security. But now, according to Patricia Rodriguez and a stack of legal documents, I had access to more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, like trying to hold two incompatible truths in my mind at the same time. I was both poverty-stricken and incredibly wealthy, both powerless and holding more power than I'd ever imagined possible. I pulled out my phone and did something I'd never done before. I Googled, "What to do when you inherit $1 billion?" The search results were predictably unhelpful, mostly articles about lottery winners and tech entrepreneurs, people whose wealth had come through luck or innovation rather than family inheritance. None of them seemed to address the specific terror of discovering that your quiet grandfather had been secretly accumulating wealth for decades while living like a man who clipped coupons and worried about the electric bill. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. "We need to talk. This isn't over." The message sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the broken air conditioning. I could hear the threat in those simple words, the promise that my siblings weren't going to accept Grandpa's decision without a fight. I thought about Patricia Rodriguez's warning that any legal challenge would be expensive and ultimately unsuccessful, but I also knew that my siblings were angry enough to make expensive mistakes. Another text came through, this one from Marcus. "Family meeting tomorrow, Mom's house, 7 p.m. We need to discuss next steps." The presumption that I would simply show up to be lectured about sharing my inheritance made my jaw clench with irritation. Marcus was already assuming leadership of some kind of intervention, probably planning to present me with a reasonable proposal for redistributing Grandpa's money according to his version of fairness. I turned off my phone without responding to either message and walked to my small bathroom, where I stared at myself in the mirror above the pedestal sink. The face looking back at me was the same one I'd seen that morning. Brown eyes, straight black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, pale skin that rarely saw much sun because I spent most of my time indoors working. I looked tired, overwhelmed, and completely ordinary. I didn't look like someone who belonged in the same category as tech moguls and oil heiresses, but maybe that was exactly the point. Maybe Grandpa had chosen me precisely because I looked and felt ordinary, because wealth hadn't been my goal or expectation. Maybe he trusted me with his fortune because I was the least likely person in the family to be corrupted by it. I filled the bathtub with lukewarm water, since hot water would have made the apartment unbearable, and tried to process the day's events while soaking away the stress and confusion. The water felt good against my skin, and for the first time since Patricia Rodriguez had walked into Mom's living room, I allowed myself to really think about what this inheritance might mean for my future. I could quit my job at Creative Solutions Design Agency and never have to worry about earning money again. I could travel anywhere in the world, see places I'd only dreamed about visiting. I could buy a house, a car that didn't make concerning noises, clothes that weren't from discount stores or thrift shops. I could go back to school, pursue advanced degrees in environmental design or sustainable architecture, study with the best minds in fields that fascinated me. But more than personal luxuries, I could also help people. I could fund scholarships for students who worked multiple jobs like I had. I could support nonprofit organizations that were struggling to make a difference with limited resources. I could invest in sustainable technology and environmental initiatives that might actually make a difference in addressing climate change. The possibilities were endless and terrifying in equal measure. With great wealth came great responsibility, and I'd never been responsible for anything more significant than meeting deadlines for graphic design projects. How was I supposed to make decisions about billions of dollars when I still used coupons at the grocery store and calculated whether I could afford name-brand cereal? My phone rang from the kitchen counter, the sound echoing through my small apartment. I ignored it, but it rang again immediately, then again. Someone was persistent, and given the day I'd had, I suspected it wasn't good news. I wrapped myself in a towel and padded to the kitchen, checking the caller ID. The number was unfamiliar, but it had a Phoenix area code. Against my better judgment, I answered. Sarah Chen, I said cautiously. Ms. Chen, this is Jonathan Mitchell from the Arizona Republic. I'm a financial reporter, and I'm working on a story about the William Chen estate distribution. I was hoping to get a comment from you about inheriting the majority of your grandfather's wealth. My blood turned to ice water. I'm sorry, what? The William Chen Trust distribution, Jonathan continued, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to pursuing reluctant interview subjects. Our sources indicate that you've inherited approximately $1 billion from trusts established by your grandfather. This is a significant story, Ms. Chen. The transformation of a working-class Phoenix woman into one of the wealthiest individuals in Arizona is exactly the kind of human interest angle our readers are interested in. I sank down onto my kitchen chair, clutching the towel around myself with one hand while gripping the phone with the other. How did you find out about this? This just happened today. Court filings are public record, Jonathan explained. Trust distributions of this magnitude require certain legal notifications. I'm hoping to get your perspective on this sudden change in your circumstances. How are you planning to use this wealth? Will you be establishing charitable foundations? Are you planning to relocate from your current neighborhood? The implication that my current neighborhood wasn't suitable for a billionaire stung, though I supposed it was probably accurate. I looked around my tiny studio apartment, trying to imagine explaining to a newspaper reporter why someone with access to unlimited funds was still living in a space smaller than most people's closets. I have no comment, I said finally. This is a private family matter. I understand your reluctance to speak publicly, Jonathan persisted, but this story is going to run with or without your input. Wouldn't you prefer to have your perspective included? I'm particularly interested in your response to family members who might contest the distribution. Our sources suggest there's significant tension within the Chen family about how the wealth is being allocated. The realization that my family's private drama was about to become public knowledge hit me like a physical blow. Not only was I dealing with the overwhelming responsibility of inherited wealth, but I was apparently going to have to navigate it under media scrutiny. Who are your sources? I demanded. I can't reveal that information, Jonathan replied smoothly, but I can tell you that multiple parties have reached out to us about this story. The Chen family situation has generated considerable interest. Multiple parties. I closed my eyes, wondering which of my siblings had decided that involving the media was a reasonable next step in their campaign to redistribute Grandpa's wealth. The idea that Marcus or Jessica or David might have contacted reporters made me feel sick to my stomach. I said no comment, I repeated firmly. Please don't contact me again. I hung up before he could respond and immediately turned off my phone. The walls of my apartment seemed to be closing in around me, and I realized that my quiet, anonymous life was about to disappear completely. By tomorrow, there would probably be news articles about my inheritance, complete with speculation about my worthiness and my family's resentment. I got dressed quickly in jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed my car keys, and headed for the door. I needed to get out of my apartment, away from ringing phones, and the suffocating weight of information that felt too big for my small space to contain. I needed to drive somewhere I could think clearly about what was happening to my life. Phoenix at sunset was beautiful in the way that only desert landscapes could be, all red rocks and purple sky, an endless horizon. I drove aimlessly through neighborhoods I'd never explored, past houses that ranged from modest to mansion-sized, wondering what it would feel like to choose where to live based on preference rather than price. I could afford any house in any neighborhood in any city in the world now, but the thought was more overwhelming than exciting. I ended up in the parking lot of South Mountain Park, one of the largest municipal parks in the country, and a place I'd always found peaceful when life felt too complicated. I parked my Honda Civic next to pickup trucks and SUVs belonging to evening hikers, and families having late picnics, people living normal lives that weren't being disrupted by billion-dollar inheritances and newspaper reporters. The hiking trails were busy with people taking advantage of the cooler evening temperatures, but I found a quiet spot on a bench overlooking the city and sat down to watch the sun set over the Phoenix skyline. From this vantage point, the city looked manageable, beautiful even, spread out below me like a glittering circuit board against the desert floor. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I realized I'd automatically turned it back on out of habit. 3 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, probably more reporters, and a string of text messages from my family. I scrolled through them, feeling my anxiety spike with each new message. Mom, honey, there are reporters calling the house. What should I tell them? Jessica, did you talk to the Arizona Republic? This is about to become a circus. We need damage control. Marcus, Sarah, call me immediately. We need a unified family response to media inquiries. David, why are there news vans in Mom's neighborhood? What did you do? The accusation in David's message, the assumption that I had somehow caused this media attention rather than being a victim of it, crystallized something that had been building in my mind all day. My family didn't see me as someone who had been thrust into an impossible situation. They saw me as someone who had somehow orchestrated this outcome, who had manipulated Grandpa into favoring me over them. I turned off the phone again and sat in the gathering darkness, watching the city lights begin to twinkle as street lights and house lights came on across the valley. Somewhere out there, reporters were probably preparing stories about my sudden wealth. Somewhere out there, my siblings were planning their next moves in what was apparently becoming a very public family battle. And somewhere out there were people living normal lives, worried about normal problems, unaware that someone sitting on a park bench was struggling with the weight of more money than most people could imagine. The temperature was finally beginning to drop as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and I realized I was hungry. I'd eaten nothing since a granola bar that morning, and the stress of the day had left me feeling hollow and shaky. I drove to a nearby McDonald's, one of the few restaurants I could afford to eat at regularly, and sat in the fluorescent-lit dining area, eating a $1 menu burger and fries, while thinking about the absurdity of my situation. I was probably one of the wealthiest people in the state of Arizona, and I was eating dinner at McDonald's because it was what I could afford with the $23 in my checking account. Tomorrow, I could probably buy the entire McDonald's franchise if I wanted to. But tonight, I was carefully counting change to make sure I could pay for my meal. The cognitive dissonance was making my head spin. I felt like I was living in some kind of parallel universe where the laws of physics didn't apply, where someone could be simultaneously rich and poor, powerful and powerless, fortunate and cursed. An elderly man at the table next to mine was reading a newspaper, and I could see the Arizona Republic logo at the top of the page. I wondered if tomorrow's edition would include my name, my photograph, details about my inheritance and my family's reaction to it. The thought of strangers reading about my private business over their morning coffee made my stomach churn. I finished my meal and drove home through neighborhoods that looked different, now that I knew I could afford to live anywhere I wanted. Houses that had once seemed impossibly luxurious now looked achievable, but the idea of choosing a new home felt overwhelming when I was still struggling to accept that my inheritance was real. Back in my apartment, I sat on my futon and opened my laptop, staring at the blank document where I usually worked on design projects for clients who paid me barely enough to survive. Tomorrow, I could call Patricia Rodriguez and begin the process of accessing funds that would make my current work unnecessary. I could quit my job, leave my apartment, start a completely new life as a wealthy woman with unlimited options. But the prospect of making those changes felt terrifying rather than exciting. This apartment might be small and hot and filled with furniture from thrift stores, but it was mine. I'd earned every piece of it through my own work, my own choices, my own determination to build a life independent of family help. If I suddenly started living like a billionaire, would I still be the same person Grandpa had trusted with his wealth? I pulled out the $50 wallet Dad had given me and set it on the coffee table where I could look at it. Such a modest gift, yet it had triggered the family fight that led to Patricia Rodriguez's visit. If my siblings hadn't been arguing over $50, would we have been gathered together when the lawyer arrived? Would the news about Grandpa's wealth have been delivered to us separately, in private consultations that might have avoided the immediate family conflict? There was something almost cosmically ironic about the timing, as if the universe had arranged for our family's greed and pettiness to be on full display at the exact moment we learned about wealth beyond our wildest dreams. We'd been squabbling over pocket change while sitting on information about billions of dollars. My laptop chimed with an email notification, and I glanced at the screen to see a message from my boss at Creative Solutions Design Agency. The subject line read, "Urgent. Need to discuss your status," and my heart sank as I realized that the media attention had probably already reached my workplace. I opened the email reluctantly. "Sarah, I've received several calls today from reporters asking about your employment with our agency. Without more information about your current situation, I can't provide appropriate responses to their inquiries. Please call me first thing tomorrow morning so we can discuss how to handle this media interest and what it means for your ongoing work with our clients. Michael." The professional tone couldn't hide the underlying concern, and I realized that my inheritance wasn't just going to change my personal life, it was going to impact everyone around me. My boss was probably worried about losing a reliable employee and dealing with media attention that could disrupt the agency's quiet work environment. My coworkers would probably treat me differently once they knew about my wealth. Even casual relationships would be affected by the knowledge that I had access to unlimited money. I closed the laptop without responding to the email and lay down on my futon, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine what my life would look like a week from now, a month from now, a year from now. The only thing I knew for certain was that nothing would ever be the same again, and I wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. The weight of responsibility Grandpa had placed on me felt enormous in the darkness of my apartment. He'd trusted me to use his wealth wisely, but what did that even mean? How was someone who'd never owned anything more expensive than a used car supposed to make decisions about billions of dollars? How was someone who'd spent her entire adult life counting pennies supposed to navigate the world of high finance and philanthropy and investment? But maybe that was exactly why he'd chosen me. Maybe he'd seen that my lack of experience with wealth was actually an advantage. That my perspective as someone who understood scarcity would help me appreciate abundance without taking it for granted. Maybe my history of making do with less had taught me skills that would be valuable in making decisions about more. I thought about the conversation with Mom in her backyard, her observation that Dad had always been proud of my independence and integrity. Maybe Grandpa had seen the same qualities, had recognized that I was someone who would work to deserve the trust he was placing in me rather than simply enjoying the privileges that came with it. The sound of sirens somewhere in the distance reminded me that I was still living in the real world, where people faced real problems that money couldn't solve. Emergency responders were rushing to help someone in crisis. Police officers were dealing with crime and conflict. Firefighters were battling blazes that threatened homes and lives. My inheritance couldn't stop accidents or prevent natural disasters or solve the fundamental problems that made people suffer, but it could help address some of the circumstances that made suffering worse. That thought gave me the first sense of purpose I'd felt since Patricia Rodriguez had walked into Mom's living room. Maybe the question wasn't whether I deserved this wealth, but what I could do with it that would honor both Grandpa's trust and the needs of people who weren't as fortunate as I'd suddenly become. I fell asleep on my futon that night, still wearing my clothes, clutching Dad's $50 wallet in my hand like a talisman connecting me to the person I'd been that morning. Tomorrow I would have to begin the process of becoming someone new, someone capable of managing wealth responsibly and navigating the complex world that came with it. But tonight, I was still Sarah Chen, the graphic designer, living in a tiny apartment and worried about making rent, holding on to the last normal night of my life before everything changed forever. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming through my apartment windows, and my phone was buzzing insistently from the kitchen counter. I'd forgotten to turn off the sound, and someone was calling repeatedly with the persistence of either an emergency or a reporter who wouldn't take no for an answer. I stumbled to the kitchen and checked the caller ID, Mom. That was slightly better than a reporter, but given yesterday's events, probably not much better. "Hi, Mom," I answered, my voice hoarse from sleep. "Thank goodness," she said, her relief evident even through the phone. "I've been trying to reach you for an hour. There are news vans parked outside my house, and reporters keep knocking on the door asking questions about you and Grandpa's money." The image of Mom trapped in her house by media attention made my chest tight with guilt and anger. She didn't deserve to be harassed because of my inheritance, and the fact that my siblings had probably contributed to this circus made it even worse. "I'm so sorry," I said. "I turned off my phone last night because reporters were calling me too. I had no idea they'd come to your house." "It's not your fault, honey," Mom said, though she sounded tired and stressed. "But we need to figure out how to handle this. Marcus thinks we should hire a publicist to manage the media response. Jessica wants to issue a statement about family unity. And David is talking about giving interviews to set the record straight about Grandpa's intentions." The idea of David giving interviews about anything, much less Grandpa's financial decisions, was terrifying. My youngest brother's tendency toward dramatic exaggeration would probably result in news coverage that bore no resemblance to reality. "Nobody should be giving interviews," I said firmly. "This is exactly what Patricia Rodriguez warned us about. The more we engage with the media, the bigger story this becomes." "That's what I told them," Mom agreed. "But they're not listening to me. They think this needs to be managed strategically, like some kind of public relations campaign." I sank down onto my kitchen chair, still wearing yesterday's clothes and feeling completely unprepared to deal with family crisis management at 7 in the morning. "What do you think I should do?" "I think," Mom said carefully, "that you should call Patricia Rodriguez and ask for her advice. She deals with wealthy families all the time. She probably knows how to handle this kind of situation." The suggestion was sensible, but it also represented another step away from my normal life and toward accepting my new reality as someone who needed legal counsel and media management. I wasn't ready to start thinking of myself as the kind of person who had these problems, but apparently I didn't have a choice. "You're right," I said. "I'll call her this morning." "And Sarah?" Mom's voice was gentle but serious. "You might want to think about finding somewhere else to stay for a few days. If reporters are at my house, they've probably found your address too." The thought of reporters camping outside my apartment building sent a wave of panic through me. My neighbors were quiet people who valued their privacy, and media attention would probably violate several lease provisions about disturbing other tenants. "I'll figure something out," I said, though I had no idea what that would be. I couldn't afford a hotel room for more than a night or two, and I didn't have close enough friends to impose on them during a media crisis. After hanging up with Mom, I made coffee with my ancient coffee maker and tried to think through my options. I could call Patricia Rodriguez and ask for advice about handling the media attention. I could try to rent a hotel room under a fake name, though I wasn't sure how to do that without proper identification. I could drive out of the city for a few days and wait for the story to die down, though that would mean missing work and potentially losing my job. Or I could embrace the fact that my life had already changed irrevocably and start making decisions as someone who had access to unlimited resources. I could rent a hotel suite, hire security, retain a publicist, and handle the situation the way wealthy people handled media attention. But that option felt like giving up on the person I'd always been and becoming someone I didn't recognize. My coffee was terrible, as usual, made with discount ground coffee and water from a tap that probably needed new filters. But it was my terrible coffee, made in my tiny kitchen, part of the life I'd built through my own work and decisions. The idea of giving up these small, familiar comforts for the luxury and complexity that came with wealth felt like a kind of death. But as I sat at my kitchen table sipping bad coffee and listening to the sounds of my neighbors getting ready for work, I realized that clinging to my old life wasn't really an option anymore. Whether I liked it or not, I was now a public figure, someone whose financial situation was newsworthy and whose decisions would be scrutinized by strangers. I could either handle that reality proactively or let it handle me, but I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. I picked up my phone and dialed the number on Patricia Rodriguez's business card, hoping she'd be available to talk me through the crisis that my inheritance had apparently created overnight. As the phone rang, I looked around my apartment one more time, memorizing the small space that had been my refuge for the past 3 years. Whatever happened next, I suspected I wouldn't be coming back here as the same person who had left yesterday morning to eat dinner at Mom's house. The transformation Grandpa had set in motion with his secret wealth was accelerating beyond my control, and I had to decide whether I was going to guide that change or let it sweep me away completely. Patricia Rodriguez answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the crisp professionalism I remembered from yesterday's meeting, though it felt like a lifetime had passed since then. "Sarah, I was hoping you'd call this morning. I assume you've seen the news coverage?" "There's news coverage already?" I asked, though I probably shouldn't have been surprised. In the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, stories about sudden wealth traveled fast. The Arizona Republic ran a front-page story this morning, Patricia confirmed. Nothing too detailed, but enough to generate significant interest. I've received calls from 3 other news outlets requesting interviews, and my office has been contacted by several financial advisors and investment firms who want to pitch their services. The idea that strangers were already trying to profit from my inheritance made my stomach turn. I hadn't even figured out how to access the money yet, and people were already lining up to help me spend it. "I need advice," I said, settling back into my kitchen chair with my terrible coffee. "My family is talking about hiring publicists and giving interviews. Reporters are camped outside my mom's house. I don't know how to handle any of this." "First rule of sudden wealth," Patricia said, her tone becoming more instructional. "Never make major decisions while you're in crisis mode. The media attention will die down in a few days if you don't feed it with statements or appearances. Your family's instinct to manage the narrative will only make the story bigger and more intrusive. So I should just hide and wait for it to go away? You should take control of the situation on your terms rather than reacting to external pressure," Patricia clarified. "I work with several clients who have faced similar media attention. There are strategies for managing public interest without sacrificing your privacy or autonomy." The word clients reminded me that I was now the type of person who needed strategies for managing public interest. 3 days ago, my biggest concern had been whether I could afford to replace my car's worn brake pads. Now I was discussing media management with a lawyer who specialized in billion-dollar estates. "What would you recommend?" I asked. "Short term, I suggest you find somewhere private to stay for a few days, while the initial frenzy dies down. I can arrange for a discreet hotel suite or a private residence where you won't be disturbed. Medium term, we need to establish a comprehensive financial management team and begin the process of structuring your inheritance for maximum benefit and minimum tax liability." The practical nature of her advice was reassuring, but it also underscored how completely my life was about to change. I would need teams of professionals, private accommodations, structured investments. I would need to become the type of person who thought in terms of tax liability and maximum benefit, rather than simply trying to pay rent and buy groceries. "And my family?" I asked. "They're already talking about legal challenges and media strategies. How do I handle that?" Patricia was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the sound of papers rustling as she consulted her notes. "Your family's reaction is unfortunately typical in these situations. Sudden wealth often reveals existing family dynamics in harsh light, and siblings who feel excluded tend to respond with aggression and publicity seeking. So this gets worse before it gets better?" "It depends on how you handle it," Patricia replied. "If you allow yourself to be drawn into public battles or negotiations that should remain private, yes, it will get much worse. If you maintain boundaries and refuse to engage with unreasonable demands, Most family members eventually accept the situation and focus on their own inheritances. The phrase "most family members" suggested that some never accepted the situation, that some inheritance disputes tore families apart permanently. I thought about Marcus's angry face yesterday, Jessica's calculating expression, David's sense of entitlement. Were these relationships salvageable, or was I looking at the beginning of permanent estrangement from my siblings? "I'd like to meet with you today if possible," I said. "I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with and what my options are." "Of course. I can clear my afternoon schedule. But first, let me arrange accommodation for you somewhere away from media attention. You shouldn't be dealing with reporters while you're trying to make important financial decisions." An hour later, I was checking into a suite at the Arizona Biltmore Resort under a name Patricia's office had arranged, carrying a small overnight bag with clothes hastily thrown together from my apartment. The luxury of the resort was overwhelming after my modest studio, all marble floors and fresh flowers and staff members who seemed to anticipate my needs before I expressed them. The suite was larger than my entire apartment, with a separate bedroom, living area, and bathroom that featured a soaking tub big enough for 3 people. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the resort's manicured gardens and the mountains beyond, a landscape that looked like something from a travel magazine rather than real life. I sat on the plush sofa in the living area and tried to process the surreal nature of my situation. 12 hours ago, I'd been eating McDonald's and worrying about affording my electric bill. Now I was staying in a resort suite that probably cost more per night than I typically spent on food in a month. And it was being paid for by lawyers managing my billion-dollar inheritance. The cognitive dissonance was becoming exhausting. I felt like I was living in someone else's life, wearing someone else's clothes, making decisions that belonged to a different kind of person entirely. The Sarah Chen who had grown up working multiple jobs and living paycheck to paycheck didn't belong in a luxury resort suite any more than she belonged in discussions about tax liability and investment strategies. My phone buzzed with another text from Marcus. "Where are you? We need to present a united front to the media. This affects all of us." The assumption that I owed my family coordination on how to handle my inheritance was infuriating, but it was also familiar. This was the same dynamic that had governed our relationships for years. Sarah should consider everyone else's needs before her own. Sarah should make decisions based on what was best for the family rather than what was best for her. Sarah should sacrifice her own interests for the greater good as defined by everyone else. But now the stakes were different. Now the decisions I made would impact not just my own modest life, but potentially millions of other people who could benefit from thoughtful philanthropy and responsible investment. Now the greater good extended far beyond my family's immediate financial concerns. I turned off my phone and ran a bath in the enormous soaking tub, adding expensive bath salts that had been provided by the resort. As I slipped into water that was actually hot for the first time in months, I allowed myself to think seriously about what I wanted to do with Grandpa's wealth. The possibilities were endless and intimidating. I could fund scholarships for students from working-class families who needed financial support to pursue their education. I could invest in sustainable technology companies that were developing solutions to environmental problems. I could support nonprofit organizations that were addressing homelessness, hunger, mental health, education inequality, criminal justice reform, or any of the dozens of other issues that affected people's lives in meaningful ways. But I could also do smaller, more personal things. I could pay off Mom's mortgage so she wouldn't have to worry about housing costs in retirement. I could establish funds for my siblings that might help them pursue their goals without the financial stress that had always constrained our family's choices. I could support local businesses and artists and organizations that were struggling to survive in an economy that made it difficult for anyone without substantial resources to thrive. The water was wonderfully warm, and for the first time since Patricia Rodriguez had walked into Mom's living room, I felt my shoulders begin to relax. Maybe the key to managing this inheritance was to think of it not as money that belonged to me, but as money I was responsible for stewarding on behalf of everyone who could benefit from it. That perspective shift changed everything. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by wealth I didn't deserve, I could focus on the responsibility I'd been given to make decisions that would honor both Grandpa's intentions and the needs of people who hadn't been as fortunate as I'd suddenly become. A knock at the suite door interrupted my thoughts, and I quickly got dressed to answer it. A hotel staff member was delivering an arrangement of fresh flowers, and a note from Patricia Rodriguez. Take time to think clearly about what you want your life to look like. The money is a tool. What matters is what you build with it. The flowers were beautiful. Exotic blooms I couldn't identify, arranged in a crystal vase that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. But it was the note that stayed with me as I prepared for my afternoon meeting with Patricia. The money was a tool, not an identity. What mattered was what I built with it. When I arrived at Patricia's office that afternoon, she had prepared a comprehensive overview of my inheritance that was both exciting and terrifying. The $1 billion wasn't sitting in a single bank account waiting for me to write checks. It was invested in a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, real estate, private equity, and alternative investments that had been carefully managed for maximum growth over decades. Your grandfather was remarkably sophisticated in his investment strategy, Patricia explained, showing me charts and graphs that detailed the portfolio's performance over time. He started with relatively modest technology investments in the 1980s and consistently reinvested his returns into emerging sectors. The cryptocurrency investments alone are now worth over $200 million. The idea that my quiet grandfather had been making cryptocurrency investments while the rest of the family struggled with basic financial planning was almost too surreal to believe. But the documentation was thorough and undeniable, showing a methodical approach to wealth building that had played out over 40 years. What are my options? I asked, studying the portfolio summary that showed investments I didn't understand in companies I'd never heard of. You have complete discretion over how to manage and deploy these assets, Patricia replied. You can maintain the current investment strategy, which has been quite successful, or you can redirect funds toward different priorities. Many of my clients choose to establish charitable foundations, create family trusts, or pursue specific philanthropic goals while maintaining enough invested capital to ensure continued growth. She handed me a folder containing information about various wealth management strategies, charitable giving options, and tax considerations that made my head spin. There were sections on donor-advised funds, private foundations, charitable remainder trusts, and investment approaches that seemed to require advanced degrees in finance to understand. This is overwhelming, I admitted. I don't know enough about any of this to make informed decisions. That's why we build teams, Patricia said gently. You'll need a financial advisor who specializes in ultra-high net worth clients, a tax attorney who understands complex estate planning, and probably a philanthropic advisor if you're interested in charitable giving. My role is to coordinate these professionals and ensure that your decisions align with your values and goals. The phrase ultra-high net worth clients was jarring. I was apparently now part of a demographic I'd never known existed, someone whose financial situation required specialized expertise and custom strategies. It was like discovering I belonged to a different species, one that operated according to rules I'd never learned. How long do I have to make these decisions? I asked. There's no rush on most of these issues, Patricia assured me. The current investment strategy is sound and doesn't require immediate changes. But there are some time-sensitive tax considerations, and the media attention means you should probably establish some basic structures sooner rather than later. We spent the next 2 hours going through various options and their implications, and by the end of the meeting, I had agreed to interviews with 3 different financial advisors, a consultation with a tax attorney, and a preliminary discussion with a philanthropic consultant who specialized in helping new philanthropists develop giving strategies. As I drove back to the resort in my ancient Honda Civic, passing luxury cars and expensive houses that I could now afford without thinking twice about the cost, I realized that my old life was disappearing more quickly than I'd anticipated. Within a few weeks, I would probably need to replace my car with something more reliable, find a new place to live that offered better security and privacy, and potentially leave my job at Creative Solutions Design Agency to focus on managing my inheritance. The prospect of making those changes felt both exciting and terrifying. I had spent my entire adult life building independence through my own work and decisions, and now I was facing the possibility of giving up that hard-earned autonomy for a different kind of life entirely. Back at the resort, I ordered room service for the first time in my life and ate a meal that cost more than I typically spent on groceries in a week. The food was delicious, but it felt strange to eat alone in a luxury suite, while my family was probably gathered at Mom's house, planning their next move in what was becoming an increasingly public drama. My phone had been buzzing periodically throughout the afternoon, with calls and texts I'd been ignoring. But when I finally checked my messages, the volume of communication was overwhelming. Reporters, family members, people claiming to be old friends, financial advisors, and others I didn't recognize, had all tried to reach me with various requests, offers, and demands for my attention. One message stood out from the others, a text from my boss at Creative Solutions Design Agency. "Sarah, I need to speak with you first thing tomorrow morning. The media attention is affecting our other clients, and we need to discuss your employment status." The reality that my inheritance was going to cost me my job hit harder than I'd expected. I loved my work at the agency, even if it didn't pay well, and the idea of losing that connection to my old life felt like another piece of my identity being stripped away. But as I sat in the resort suite eating expensive food and looking out at mountain views that most people only saw in vacation photos, I had to acknowledge that my old job was probably incompatible with my new circumstances anyway. It would be difficult to focus on small graphic design projects when I was responsible for managing investments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It would be hard to relate to clients worried about marketing budgets when I had access to unlimited resources. The transformation that Grandpa had set in motion was accelerating beyond my ability to control it, and I had to decide whether I was going to fight the changes or embrace them. Fighting meant clinging to a life that was no longer sustainable, and pretending that nothing fundamental had shifted. Embracing meant accepting that I was becoming someone new, someone with different responsibilities and opportunities than the person I'd been just 2 days earlier. That night, I called Mom from the resort suite to check on how she was handling the media attention. Her voice sounded tired and strained, and I could hear the television in the background, probably tuned to news coverage of our family situation. "How are you holding up?" I asked. "It's been a difficult day," she admitted. "The reporters finally left around dinner time, but the phone has been ringing constantly. People from high school, distant relatives I haven't heard from in years. All kinds of folks suddenly wanting to reconnect now that you're in the news." The idea that people were coming out of the woodwork to contact my family because of my inheritance was nauseating. I thought about all the times I'd struggled financially when none of these people had shown any interest in my welfare, and their sudden attention now felt predatory rather than supportive. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this," I said. "It's not fair that you're being harassed because of something I didn't ask for and can't control." "It's not your fault, honey," Mom replied, echoing what she'd said that morning. "But I am worried about how this is affecting the family. Marcus and Jessica have been here most of the day strategizing about how to challenge Grandpa's will. David is talking about writing a book about growing up in a family with secret wealth. Everyone seems to think this situation can be managed or manipulated somehow." The mental image of David writing a book filled with dramatic exaggerations and self-serving narratives about our family was horrifying. My youngest brother had never let facts get in the way of a good story, and the idea of him profiting from our family's private business made my chest tight with anger. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. Mom was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her moving around the house, probably cleaning up after a day of dealing with family chaos and media attention. "I think," she said finally, "that you should trust your instincts and do what feels right to you, regardless of what anyone else thinks you should do. Your grandfather chose you for this responsibility because he trusted your judgment. That's more important than keeping everyone else happy." The permission to prioritize my own judgment over family harmony was exactly what I needed to hear, though it also underscored how isolated I was becoming from the people who had shaped my entire life. If Mom was encouraging me to ignore my siblings' demands, it meant she recognized that our family relationships were probably about to change permanently. "I love you, Mom," I said, meaning it more than I'd ever meant anything. "I love you too, sweetheart, and I'm proud of you for how you're handling this impossible situation." After we hung up, I sat in the resort suite thinking about what it meant to trust my instincts, when my instincts had been shaped by a lifetime of scarcity and low expectations. My gut told me to be generous with my family, to share the wealth that felt too enormous for one person to manage responsibly. But my brain recognized that generosity motivated by guilt or pressure was different from generosity motivated by genuine care and strategic thinking. The next morning brought a meeting with the first financial advisor on Patricia's recommended list, a woman named Catherine Lowe, who specialized in sustainable investing and socially responsible wealth management. Her office was in a gleaming downtown Phoenix high-rise, and her conference room overlooked the city with views that stretched to the mountains on the horizon. Catherine was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with an intensity and intelligence that reminded me of the most driven professors I'd had in college. She'd clearly done her research on my inheritance and came prepared with specific recommendations for how to structure my wealth for maximum social impact while ensuring continued growth. "The opportunity you have," she said, showing me a presentation about impact investing and philanthropic strategies, "is to demonstrate that extreme wealth can be used responsibly to address systemic problems rather than simply accumulating for its own sake." Her approach appealed to me because it treated my inheritance as a tool for social change rather than personal luxury. She outlined strategies for investing in companies that were developing sustainable technologies, supporting nonprofit organizations that were addressing inequality and injustice, and creating programs that would provide opportunities for people who lacked access to capital and resources. "What about my family?" I asked. "They're expecting some kind of redistribution of the inheritance." Catherine's expression became more serious. "Family pressure is one of the biggest challenges my clients face," she said. "The temptation to make financial decisions based on guilt or family harmony rather than strategic thinking can undermine everything you're trying to accomplish." She showed me case studies of other wealthy families where attempts to satisfy everyone's financial expectations had led to poor investment decisions, family conflicts that escalated rather than resolved, and philanthropic efforts that failed because they were motivated by pressure rather than genuine commitment. "My recommendation," Catherine continued, "is that you establish clear boundaries about how you'll use your wealth and stick to those boundaries regardless of family pressure. You can certainly choose to support your family members, but those decisions should be made strategically and with clear expectations rather than in response to demands." Her advice aligned with what Patricia Rodriguez had been telling me, and it reinforced my growing sense that managing extreme wealth required a different mindset than managing ordinary family relationships. I couldn't make decisions based solely on keeping everyone happy, because that approach would ultimately help no one and potentially waste resources that could be used to address real problems. By the time I left Catherine's office, I had a clearer sense of what I wanted to do with my inheritance. I would establish a foundation focused on educational opportunities for students from working-class backgrounds, invest in sustainable technology companies that were developing solutions to environmental problems, and support organizations that were addressing inequality and social justice issues. I would also create trust for my family members that would provide financial security without enabling destructive behavior. Mom would receive enough money to ensure a comfortable retirement without having to worry about medical expenses or housing costs. My siblings would receive structured support that would help them pursue their goals while encouraging responsibility and personal growth. But I would not negotiate the basic structure of Grandpa's bequest, and I would not allow family pressure to dictate how I used wealth that had been specifically entrusted to me. The responsibility I'd been given was too important to be undermined by guilt or misplaced loyalty. That afternoon, I met with Marcus, Jessica, and David at a neutral location, a conference room at Patricia Rodriguez's law firm, where our conversation could be private and professional. They arrived together, presenting a united front that immediately made me feel like I was walking into an ambush. Marcus had prepared what looked like a formal presentation, complete with printed documents and charts showing various redistribution scenarios. His real estate background was evident in his systematic approach to what he clearly saw as a negotiation rather than a family conversation. "We've been doing research on inheritance law and family trusts," he began, spreading his materials across the conference table. "There are precedents for modifying distributions when they create significant inequality among family members." "Grandpa's distribution wasn't random," I replied, settling into my chair and trying to project more confidence than I felt. "He made specific decisions based on his assessment of our characters and our ability to handle wealth responsibly." Jessica leaned forward, her marketing training evident in the way she framed her response. "But those assessments were based on limited information and outdated assumptions about our priorities and capabilities. We've all grown and changed since we were children." It's not fair to hold us to standards that were established when we were too young to demonstrate our real potential. The argument was more sophisticated than I'd expected, and for a moment I felt my resolve wavering. Maybe Grandpa had been wrong to judge us based on childhood behavior. Maybe my siblings deserved a chance to prove they could handle wealth responsibly. But then I remembered Patricia Rodriguez reading Grandpa's letter, his observations about not just our childhood behavior but our adult choices, our treatment of others, our responses to both success and difficulty. His assessments hadn't been based on limited information. They'd been based on decades of careful observation. Grandpa didn't just know us as children, I said. He watched us become adults. He saw how we handled money, relationships, and responsibility. His decisions were based on 30 years of observation, not childhood impressions. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, probably remembering various incidents over the years when his lack of responsibility had been on full display. But people can change, he said. Just because I made some mistakes when I was younger doesn't mean I can't handle money responsibly now. Then prove it, I replied. Use the trust Grandpa established for you to demonstrate the responsibility he wanted to see. Show that you can hold a job, manage money wisely, and make decisions based on long-term thinking rather than immediate gratification. $25 million contingent on meeting arbitrary standards is insulting, David shot back, his voice rising with the petulant tone I remembered from childhood arguments. Everyone else gets their money immediately, but I have to jump through hoops like some kind of probationary employee. Everyone else isn't 25 years old with a history of changing majors every semester and quitting jobs every few months, I pointed out. Grandpa's requirements aren't arbitrary. They're specifically designed to address patterns of behavior that concerned him. Marcus intervened before David could respond, probably recognizing that his brother's defensiveness wasn't helping their cause. Look, we're not here to relitigate Grandpa's decisions or argue about who deserves what. We're here to find a solution that works for everyone. I'm listening, I said, though I was already skeptical about any solution that required me to give up wealth that had been specifically entrusted to me. Marcus consulted his notes and launched into what was clearly a prepared proposal. We think the fairest approach would be to establish a family foundation that pools all of the inheritance money and distributes it according to family decisions made by majority vote. That way, everyone has input into how the money is used, and no one person has disproportionate control over resources that really belong to all of us. The proposal was clever, framed in language about fairness and family unity that was difficult to argue against directly. But it would also completely undermine Grandpa's intentions and remove the responsibility he'd specifically placed on me to make decisions about how his wealth should be used. That's not what Grandpa wanted, I said. He could have established a family foundation if that's what he'd intended. Instead, he made specific decisions about how his wealth should be distributed based on his assessment of our individual characters and capabilities. But those decisions are tearing our family apart, Jessica said, her voice carrying what sounded like genuine emotion. Is that really what Grandpa would have wanted? For his money to destroy the relationships between his grandchildren? The question hit me harder than I'd expected, because it forced me to confront the possibility that Grandpa's gift was going to cost me my family. Was preserving relationships with my siblings worth sacrificing the responsibility I'd been given to use extreme wealth for maximum social benefit? But as I looked across the conference table at Marcus's calculated presentation, Jessica's manipulative appeal to family loyalty, and David's entitled expectation that his inheritance should come without requirements, I realized that these weren't the kind of relationships worth preserving at any cost. These were relationships based on my willingness to subordinate my own judgment to their preferences, to sacrifice my own interests for their benefit, to accept less so they could have more. Grandpa's money isn't destroying our family, I said finally. It's revealing what our family relationships were really based on. If you can only love me when I'm giving you what you want, then we never had real relationships anyway. The silence that followed was heavy with hurt and anger, but it was also clarifying. I could see in their faces that they weren't going to accept my refusal to redistribute the inheritance. And I could see in my own heart that I wasn't going to sacrifice Grandpa's trust to maintain relationships that were contingent on my compliance with their demands. So that's it? Marcus asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. You're going to keep everything and let the family fall apart? I'm going to honor the responsibility Grandpa gave me, I replied. And I'm going to establish trusts for all of you that will provide financial security and opportunity without enabling destructive behavior. But I'm not going to negotiate away wealth that was specifically entrusted to me based on guilt or pressure. Jessica stood up from the conference table, gathering her purse and coat with sharp, angry movements. This is a mistake, Sarah. You're choosing money over family, and you're going to regret it. I'm choosing responsibility over convenience, I corrected. And I hope someday you'll understand the difference. They left the conference room together, and I could hear their voices in the hallway discussing next steps and legal options. I sat alone at the conference table for several minutes, processing the finality of what had just happened and the loneliness of the path I'd chosen. But underneath the sadness and fear, I also felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For the first time in my life, I had chosen my own judgment over family pressure, my own values over other people's expectations. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, and it felt like the first authentic decision I'd made as the person I was becoming rather than the person I'd always been expected to be. Over the following weeks, I began the complex process of restructuring my life around the reality of extreme wealth. I hired Catherine Liu as my financial advisor and began implementing investment strategies that aligned with my values. I established the educational foundation I'd been planning and started funding scholarships for students from working-class backgrounds. I moved out of my tiny apartment and into a modest house in a quiet Phoenix neighborhood, traded my ancient Honda Civic for a reliable hybrid car, and gradually adjusted to living with financial security for the first time in my adult life. The media attention faded as Patricia had predicted, replaced by other stories and scandals that captured public interest. My family's legal challenge to Grandpa's will proceeded slowly through the courts, but as Patricia had warned, it was expensive and ultimately unsuccessful. The documentation of Grandpa's intentions was too thorough, and the legal structure of the trusts too sound to be overturned by arguments about fairness or family unity. My relationship with my siblings remained strained, though we maintained polite contact through Mom and holiday gatherings that were formal and careful, rather than warm and spontaneous. David eventually met the requirements for his trust and received his inheritance at 30, using it to start a production company that actually succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Marcus and Jessica both used their $50 million to expand their businesses and lifestyles, though they never quite forgave me for not sharing more of the wealth they believed should have been theirs. But the relationship that surprised me most was the one I developed with Mom, who became my closest advisor and strongest supporter as I learned to navigate the responsibilities that came with extreme wealth. She helped me understand family history I'd never known, stories about Grandpa's early struggles, and his determination to create opportunities for future generations that he'd never had himself. He would be proud of what you're building, she told me one evening as we sat in my new backyard, watching the sunset over the mountains and discussing the latest projects my foundation was funding. He always said the purpose of wealth wasn't to make life easier, but to make life more meaningful. 5 years later, as I sat in my foundation's offices reviewing grant applications and investment reports, I realized that Grandpa had given me something far more valuable than money. He'd given me the opportunity to discover who I could become when I wasn't constrained by other people's limitations or expectations. He'd trusted me to use extreme wealth responsibly, and in living up to that trust, I'd found a sense of purpose and authenticity I'd never experienced before. The $50 wallet Dad had given me still sat on my desk, a reminder of where I'd come from and how dramatically my life had changed. But it was also a reminder that the most valuable gifts weren't always the most expensive ones, and that family love expressed through small gestures could be more meaningful than family demands for large redistributions. I never regretted the decision to honor Grandpa's wishes, rather than cave to family pressure. The path I'd chosen was sometimes lonely and always challenging, but it was authentically mine in a way that my old life of accepting less and expecting little had never been. Grandpa had seen potential in me that I'd never recognized in myself, and his trust had given me the courage to become the person I'd always had the capacity to be, but had never had the opportunity to discover. The responsibility of extreme wealth was enormous, but so was the opportunity to use it for purposes larger than any individual family drama. Every scholarship I funded, Every sustainable technology I invested in, every organization I supported, was a testament to the wisdom of Grandpa's decision, and the possibility that wealth could be a force for justice rather than division. In the end, my siblings had been right about one thing. The inheritance had changed everything. But the changes it brought were ultimately more about character than money, more about discovering authentic purpose than acquiring luxury, more about building something meaningful than simply accumulating resources. Grandpa's gift had been the chance to become who I was meant to be, and that transformation was worth more than all the billions in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.